before there were Greeks or Romans, before the world had maps, alphabets, or borders. There was a people living between the Adriatic Sea and the rugged Balkan mountains. The land we now call Albania was already ancient when ancient history began. Beneath its soil lie cities older than legend, traces of a civilization that may have existed long before Europe learned to write. But for some reason, when the story of Europe is told, this corner of the continent is treated as a blank page, forgotten, ignored, erased. Archaeological sites like Malik, Kakran, and Burim reveal that the first organized communities here appeared as early as the 6th millennium BC. These people built fortified settlements, cultivated the land, and traded with neighbors long before Mycenae or Troy ever appeared. Their pottery, tools, and art show an understanding of geometry, symmetry, and metallurgy that shouldn't have been possible in such an uncivilized region. At least, according to the traditional narrative the deeper researchers dig, the more the evidence refuses to fit the old story. Some scientists argue that the ancestors of modern Albanians are the direct descendants of these prehistoric communities, not newcomers, but survivors. A people who watched empires rise and fall around them while maintaining an unbroken link to Europe's earliest inhabitants. If that's true, then Albania isn't just another Balkan nation. It's one of the last living fragments of prehistoric Europe, a place where the line between myth and memory is still visible. Yet, history books rarely acknowledge this possibility. Greek and Roman historians, who shaped much of what we now call Western civilization, describe the region's inhabitants as wild tribes, barbarians unworthy of cultural credit. But what if that was never true? What if they weren't barbarians at all, but a rival civilization deliberately written out of history? After all, history isn't always about facts. It's about who had the power to decide which facts survived. So maybe the real story of ancient Albania isn't one of isolation or backwardness. Maybe it's the opposite. Maybe this was where the foundations of Europe quietly took shape before being claimed by others, a land that didn't need to borrow civilization because it was civilization itself, long before anyone else realized it. The Illyrians, a name whispered in passing in most history classes, yet once spoken with fear across the Adriatic. From the 2nd millennium BC until the rise of Rome, the Illyrians dominated a massive portion of the Balkans. Their influence stretched from modern-day Albania and Kosovo to Croatia, Bosnia, and parts of Montenegro. But who were they really? And why does their story seem to vanish just as Europe begins to define itself? Some historians insist the Illyrians were nothing more than a loose federation of tribes, primitive warriors who raided their Greek and Roman neighbors. But the artifacts tell another story. The Illyrians had their own symbols, religion, and royal dynasties. They built fortified hilltop cities and minted coins with distinct imagery, suggesting a shared identity that goes far beyond barbarian raiders. They were sailors, traders, and diplomats. Some scholars even believe they were among the first Europeans to create maritime trade routes that later connected to the early Mediterranean world. The controversy deepens when it comes to their origins. Were the Illyrians newcomers migrating into the Balkans from the north, or had they always been there? Genetic studies and linguistic traces increasingly suggest that the Illyrians were autochthonous, native to the Western Balkans for millennia. That means they didn't invade the region. They were the region. And if that's true, then modern Albanians, who speak a language with deep structural links to the Illyrian tongue, could be their direct descendants, not conquerors or settlers, but the last voice of a vanished civilization. Yet many scholars resist that idea, often for political reasons. Acknowledging that the Albanians descend from the Illyrians would reshape the national identities of multiple Balkan countries and rewrite centuries of imperial propaganda. It would challenge Greek and Roman narratives that painted the Illyrians as outsiders. And it would mean that the oldest continuously existing people in Europe might not be in Athens or Rome, but in Tirana. But perhaps that's exactly why the Illyrians were forgotten. Their power didn't come from empire, marble temples, or famous philosophers. It came from endurance, from surviving waves of conquerors, from Macedonians to Romans to Byzantines, while never truly disappearing. Every empire that entered the Balkans claimed to have civilized the Illyrians. But the truth may be that they simply renamed them. When Rome arrived in the Balkans, it didn't just conquer the Illyrians, it absorbed them. The Illyrian kingdoms, once powerful enough to challenge Greek city-states and Roman legions alike, were dismantled piece by piece. The Romans called it pacification, but what it really was assimilation. The language, traditions, and gods of the Illyrians were systematically erased, replaced by Latin culture, Roman law, and imperial identity. Yet, beneath that Roman veneer, something older refused to die. Some Illyrians rose within the empire itself. Several Roman emperors, including Diocletian, Constantine the Great, and Justinian, were born in Illyrian provinces. Officially, they were Romans, but ethnically, that's still debated. Some researchers argue that these figures weren't Romans by blood, but Illyrians who mastered the empire's system from within. If that's true, then parts of the Roman Empire's legacy, its architecture, military reforms, and even its religion, might actually carry Illyrian fingerprints. The line between conqueror and conquered becomes blurry. But after Rome fell, so did its control over history. Byzantine chronicles inherited the Roman narrative and continued to describe the Western Balkans as a land of fading tribes and wandering peoples. Then came the Slavic migrations, or invasions, depending on who you ask. The chronicles describe vast waves of Slavic settlers moving south in the 6th and 7th centuries, supposedly overwhelming the native populations, but that's where the record becomes suspiciously silent. How did entire populations, the Illyrians included, simply vanish? Some modern scholars argue they didn't vanish at all. Instead, they adapted. They changed names, adopted new languages, and blended into the emerging Byzantine and Slavic worlds, while quietly preserving elements of their older culture. Linguists have found ancient Illyrian place names surviving across Albania and Montenegro. Folklore, symbols, and even certain Albanian words trace back to Illyrian roots. And so, while the Romans claimed victory and the Byzantines claimed continuity, what might have really happened is something else entirely: survival through silence. By the Middle Ages, Western Europe had largely forgotten the Illyrians, but in the mountains of Albania, where foreign armies struggled to conquer, something of them remained. Is it coincidence that the Albanians, the people of this rugged land, speak a language unlike any other in Europe? One that seems to defy classification, connected to no modern linguistic family? Or is it the final proof that Illyria never truly fell? It just changed its name. As the Middle Ages unfolded, Albania became a battleground of faiths, empires, and identities. The Byzantines claimed it as a vital frontier of the Christian East. The Bulgarians, Serbs, and Venetians each fought to control its cities and coasts, and then came the Ottoman Turks, bringing with them not just conquest, but transformation. For nearly 5 centuries, Albania lived between two worlds, Christianity and Islam, East and West, survival and submission. But through all this chaos, one pattern stands out. The Albanians never fully disappeared into anyone else's story. In medieval chronicles, the Albanians seem to emerge suddenly, as if out of nowhere, in the 11th century. Yet historians now argue they never appeared. They were always there, misnamed or ignored under older labels like Illyrian or Dardanian. The Byzantine historian Anna Komnene described the Albanians as fierce, independent, and almost ungovernable. They lived in mountain strongholds, spoke a language distinct from both Greek and Slavic, and refused to be absorbed by the surrounding empires. Their culture wasn't imported, it was preserved. By the 14th and 15th centuries, Albania produced one of the most legendary figures in Balkan history, Gjergj Kastrioti, better known as Skanderbeg. To the west, he was a Christian hero who resisted Ottoman domination to the Ottomans, a rebel and traitor. But beyond politics, Skanderbeg became a symbol of something deeper: continuity. A reminder that even after centuries of foreign rule, a people who had supposedly disappeared could still rise again and claim their own destiny. His resistance revived echoes of the Illyrian spirit, fierce, proud, and impossible to erase. And then, once more, history tried to silence Albania. After Skanderbeg's death, Ottoman rule tightened its grip. Many Albanians converted to Islam, others fled, and their distinct identity was buried under centuries of imperial administration. Yet their traditions endured, in songs, in language, in mountain codes of honor. Some of these customs, like the Kanun of Leka Dukagjini, are believed to preserve social values that reach back to Illyrian tribal laws. In other words, the Albanians weren't just surviving history, they were carrying it. By the time the Ottoman Empire began to crumble, Europe was rediscovering its ancient past, but rarely did it look toward Albania. Western archaeologists rushed to Greece and Italy, while Illyrian ruins were left untouched, their stories untold. It's as if the narrative of Europe's origins had already been written, and Albania didn't fit neatly inside it. But that silence only made one question louder. How can a nation so old still be so unknown? When Albania finally emerged as a modern nation in the early 20th century, it wasn't being born, it was reawakening. But Europe treated it as a late arrival, a small and chaotic newcomer at the edge of civilization. Few seem to realize that Albania might actually represent the oldest unbroken cultural line on the continent. From prehistoric villages to Illyrian kings, from Roman emperors to medieval heroes, the Albanian story has always been there, hidden in plain sight, beneath layers of conquest and rewritten history. Modern archaeology and genetics are beginning to peel back those layers. Studies reveal a striking continuity between ancient Illyrian DNA and that of today's Albanians, suggesting not migration, but survival. And yet, this idea is still controversial, because if it's true, then the foundation of European identity itself may need to be re-examined. The Greeks and Romans are credited as Europe's cultural founders, but what if the people who shaped them came from the rugged Western Balkans, long before Athens or Rome existed? What if the true cradle of European civilization was Illyria, and by extension, Albania? The idea sounds radical, but the clues are everywhere. The earliest Indo-European linguistic roots appear strikingly close to the old Illyrian regions. The Adriatic coast served as a crossroads for trade, language, and myth, connecting east and west before borders existed, and even ancient Greek sources, while often dismissive, couldn't deny the Illyrians' presence or influence. If the Albanians are indeed their descendants, then their survival isn't just a national story, it's a continental one. So why does this matter? Because the story of Europe has always been selective, told from the centers of power, not from its edges. But sometimes, the truth hides in those edges. Albania's history challenges the idea that civilization flowed only from the Mediterranean heartlands outward. It suggests the opposite, that parts of Europe's foundation were forged in the mountains, among people who refused to vanish, no matter how many empires claimed their land. Today, Albania stands at a crossroads again, not between empires, but between recognition and obscurity. The question is no longer whether it belongs to Europe, but whether Europe is ready to admit that Albania may have been part of its story since the very beginning. Because if the Albanians are indeed the living descendants of the Illyrians, then Europe's forgotten corner isn't on the periphery at all. It's right at the center, quietly carrying the memory of where it all began. If you walk through the Albanian highlands today, through the silent ruins of ancient Illyria or the narrow stone paths of Gjirokastra, you can feel it. That strange sense of continuity, as if the land itself remembers something the books forgot. Every mountain fortress, every word of the Albanian language, every custom passed down in secret, whispers a single message. We were here first. And maybe they were. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. The history of Europe was never written by those who lived it. It was written by those who conquered it. When the Greeks recorded their myths, when the Romans chronicled their victories, they decided what counted as civilization and what didn't. The Illyrians, the Pelasgians, the Thracians, they became tribes, their complexity erased. But archaeology doesn't lie. It's beginning to tell a story that written history refused to. That the people of this land weren't latecomers to civilization, but among its founders. Maybe that's why Albania's story remains so controversial. Because if Europe admits that its roots reach deeper into Illyrian soil than into Athenian marble or Roman stone, everything changes. The narrative of who built Europe, of who was civilized and who was not, begins to crumble. The forgotten Balkans become the origin, not the outskirts. So perhaps the question isn't whether the Albanians are descended from the Illyrians, but why so many have tried to deny it. Why entire empires and modern historians have fought to keep that idea buried. Maybe it's not about facts at all, but pride. Because if this small, stubborn nation, often dismissed, often ignored, truly carries the blood and spirit of Europe's first civilization, then the map of history has been upside down all along. And maybe that's the real story of ancient Albania. Not conquest, not empire, but endurance. A people who survived every rewriting of history, every erasure, every invasion, and still stand today as living proof that sometimes the oldest voices are the ones we hear last.